Okay, I'm going to offer some opening words. These are from 23 years ago now. Rebecca Parker's talk, What They Dreamed Be Ours to Do, Lessons from the History of the Covenant, which were from a General Assembly in 1998 in Rochester, New York, where Maya lives. And she said this: let us covenant with one another to keep faith with the source of life, knowing that we are not our own, earth made us. Let us covenant with one another to keep faith with the community of resistance, never to forget that life can be saved from that which threatens it by even small bands of people choosing to put into practice an alternative way of life. And let us covenant with one another to seek for an ever deeper awareness of that which springs up inwardly in us, even when our hearts are broken by our own failure or the failure of others cutting into our lives. Even when we have done all we can and life is still broken, there is a universal love that has never broken faith with us and never will. This is the ground of our hope and the reason we can be bold in seeking to fulfill the promise. And I should have said, I'm Meg Riley, one of the co-moderators of the UUA, and it's really wonderful to be here with all of you tonight.
And I would like to start us by sharing with everyone the charge that was given to the Article 2 Study Commission by the board and by Alandria Williams. Yeah, since I'm from Knoxville, I will take every opportunity to lift her up. But anyway, I think it will set up exactly kind of what we're about in a pretty clear way so that everyone kind of gets that. So I will share my screen now. And
we as in faith have been rooted in our values, principles, purposes, and sources. We are excited to continue our work as a General Assembly around Article 2. We have had sessions each General Assembly over the last couple of years that have helped us build the charge to the Article 2 Commission. So here's the words directly from the charge. Article 2 of the UUA bylaws, principles, and purposes is the foundation for all of the work of our UUA and its member congregations and covenanted communities. It is the covenant to which all of our congregations and covenanted communities pledge themselves when they become members of our UUA. Our current principles and purposes were last revised in 1987. There have been many projects, resolutions, task forces, and other strategies that have come from the board, Commission on Appraisal, and grassroots groups, which encourage us to take a look at our principles, purposes, bylaws, and rules. It is time for us to do a review and make changes so that we are living into the Unitarian Universalism of the future, a Unitarian Universalism that holds us in times of great need and ethical, moral, and spiritual crisis. We are in one of those times now. The charge to the Commission. The Article 2 Study Commission is hereby charged to review Article 2 of the UUA bylaws and propose any revisions that will enable our UUA, our member congregations, and our covenanted communities to be a relevant and powerful force for spiritual and moral growth, healing, and justice. Proposed changes should articulate core UU theological values. The board believes that one core theological value shared widely among Unitarian Universalists is love. The Commission on Appraisal, in its report, Engaging Our Theological Diversity, cites Robert Miller's study of Unitarian Universalism, stating, UUs rate loving as an instrumental value and mature love as a terminal value more highly than other respondents from other groups, religious and non-religious alike. Dr. Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public. Our commitment to personal, institutional, and cultural changes rooted in anti-oppression, anti-racism, and multiculturalism values and practices is love in action and should be centered in any revision of Article 2. The new principles and purposes should guide us in the transformation of ourselves, our communities, and our faith, and to active networks of collective care, restoration, and justice. The principles and purposes you will prepare should be a living document that challenges Unitarian Universalists to place the liberation and all of its dimensions of all at the center of our lives. They should be honest about our past, name what we are facing and our aspirations, and where we hope to be not just for today, but looking out into the horizons. They should ask us to choose love and action as the path forward. Our commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, dismantling white supremacy, and multiculturalism is love in action and should be centered in any revision of Article 2. Finally, the principles and purposes should lead us into the second quarter of the 21st century while honoring the historic roots of our liberal progressive faith. We therefore charge this commission to root its work in love as a principal guide in its work, attending particularly to the ways that we and our root traditions have understood and articulated love and how we have acted out of love. At its conduct its work, the commission shall seek to engage the active participation of UUs across all demographics, identities, and theological, philosophical beliefs. The commission shall be open and transparent in its work, communicating progress frequently with UUs through as many channels and communication media as possible. Further, the commission shall decenter habitual practices that reinforce white supremacy culture. The commission is instructed to include in all of its considerations and deliberations a clear call at General Assembly in 2017 for the inclusion of another principle, explicitly calling us to be committed to active anti-racism. We also note that there's a growing urging, heard even before the last review of the principles at Minneapolis in 2010, for us to better articulation our recognition of rights of being for all creatures, all living beings. The commission should consider how this might be included. We specifically direct their attentions to the 2010 proposals, recognizing how close those came to passing. There's good work there that should be salvaged for our time. The commission is charged with reviewing all sections of Article 2 and is free to revise, replace, or restructure them as needed to meet the objectives stated above. There is nothing sacred about the number of principles or sources, nor their specific wording, nor in the way that Article 2 is laid out. We encourage creativity. The board would like to see an Article 2 that is inspirational, memorable, and poetic. The language should be inclusive and welcoming, and explicitly anti-racist. Article 2, it must be remembered, are broad statements of principles and purpose, not detailed programmatic or implementation plans. We particularly urge the commission to review the sources, the revised listing from the 2010 proposal, and its explicit inclusion of Unitarian Universalism as our sources seem timely to us. And there are other recommended sources in that proposal. In addition, there have been energetic discussions about how other faith traditions, as Buddhism and Islam, among others, might be included or put on footings more equal to those of Christianity and Judaism. Proposed changes must be submitted to the UUA Board of Trustees, and so that they can be considered by the board and then placed on the General Assembly business agenda for the first vote. So next we want to welcome and share who the already appointed Article 2 commissioners, and we're so excited. So get ready to be bothered by them and to be talked to by them and for them to help guide us in this process.
So that's our charge. And I'll turn it over to Becky and Cheryl, who are our co-chairs.
Good evening, everyone. I'm the Reverend Cheryl M. Walker, and I am one of the co-chairs. I live in North Carolina. I am so pleased to be able to introduce the members of your commission. It's not our commission, it's yours, because it is a fantastic group of people. I applaud the board over and over for their wisdom in their choices. That being said, let me introduce them. Becky Brooks from Maryland is the co-chair. Maya Waller, one of our young adults, is from upstate New York. Rob Spirko, who you've heard speaking, is from Tennessee. Paula Cole Jones needs no introduction. She's from Washington, D.C. And Satya Mamdani, who unfortunately could not be with us this evening. I also want to introduce to you our board liaisons. Kathy Burek, who is also not with us this evening. Greg Boyd, who has been invaluable to us, as has Kathy. And of course, Meg Riley. Thank you all. But all of this work cannot be done just by us alone. So one of the key people in this commission is our project coordinator, Marcus Fagliano. We give great thanks for their work. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Rob, and you, Paula, so that we can get our panel discussion started. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Rob, are you going to mention purpose?
Yes. So this is the first public event that we've had at the Article 2. We're taking seriously the admonition to pursue many channels, right? So there are lots of different ways that we're going to be reaching out to people. We'll have sessions of General Assembly. We have other kinds of gatherings scheduled. And so, but this is another experiment we're trying tonight. Paula has sort of graciously let us kind of use the eighth principle framework to get the meeting set up, and we're very appreciative. Thanks, Greg. Greg just put in the chat the video. Unfortunately, it was a little quiet, and so if you need to listen to it again, it's available there. So yeah, I want to preview real quickly the structure of the evening so everyone kind of understands what we're doing, and then we'll get into it. The evening, we thought about different ways to organize this. I think we're often used to in Unitarian Universalist circles to sort of open conversations or group discussions or things of that nature. Or we're used to lectures and all that sort of stuff. One of the issues with those kind of conversations, while they can be fertilizing and ideas can come up in the flow and the give and take of conversation, they also tend to privilege people who already feel empowered to speak up in a given context. They also take us away from a certain level of individual discernment. So the way we've organized this evening is that we're going to have a conversation about covenant between three people who know covenant very well, who we'll be introduced to in a moment. And after they have addressed some of the questions we prepared for them, we're going to turn it over to you all. We're going to give you a chance to provide your feedback to us on a different set of questions that we are interested in all of your answers to. And that will be done on a Google form in the next portion of the session. Google Forms have the advantage of being accessible to screen readers. So if you use that technology, they're easy to use. And then after that, we'll come back here for a closing. But we want you to compose your thoughts kind of in the moment in response to this conversation as you're feeling inspired by it. One of the things we look for as Unitarian Universalists is prophecy. And it's really hard to systematize prophecy and insight and discernment. So we're trying this out to see how it works. So we would like to hear all your voices. And this is one of the ways we're attempting to do that. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Paula.
Thank you, Rob. And I would like to introduce our guest speakers this evening. We have Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, Reverend Bill Sinkford, and Reverend Meredith Garmon. And I'm going to give you a brief sort of brief bios on them. So Reverend Susan Frederick Gray is the 9th president of our association, of the Unitarian Universalist Association. She's serving in a 6-year term that began in 2017. Susan brings a strong focus on mission and strategic planning to her leadership at the UUA as it works to dismantle systems of white supremacy. As president, some of you have probably heard this comment. Susan has emphasized that this is no time for a casual faith and no time to go it alone. Prior to her election, she served as the lead minister for the UU congregation of Phoenix, Arizona, and she is known as a national voice for immigrant rights. Susan is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist with roots at Elliott Chapel in St. Louis, Missouri. During her time at Harvard University, she served as the student minister of religious education in Winchester, Unitarian Universalist Society. She has also served with the First UU Church in Nashville and also the First UU Church of Youngstown, Ohio. And with someone with a science background, I found it interesting that Susan worked before her going into ministry. She worked in molecular biology. How about that? So she has her bachelor's degree in biology. Next, I'd like to tell you a little more about Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray. Sorry about that. Reverend Dr. William Sinkford, who likes to be referred to as Bill. He serves currently as the senior minister of the First Unitarian Church in Portland, Oregon, where he began in 2010. Is it okay for me to say Bill while we're in this introductions? Okay. Bill served as the president of our association from 2001 to 2009. He was the 7th president of our association, elected president, and the first African American to lead any traditionally white denomination. He was named one of the 10 most influential Black religious leaders in the U.S. In 2005 and 2006. Bill's commitment to liberal religion dates back to his teenage years, where he was an active member of his congregation, the First Unitarian Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he also served as the president of the Liberal Religious Youth, LRY. He had a successful career in the corporate world and then went into ministry after he completed his Master's of Divinity at Starr King School. He joined the UUA staff, which is where I met you first, and he served until he was elected to the presidency. Bill earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1968, and he also holds honorary doctorates from Tufts University and Meadville Lombard Theological School. And I'd like to introduce you also to Reverend Meredith Garmon, who is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist. We have depth here on this bench. He currently serves as the minister of Community Unitarian Universalist Congregation at White Plains in New York. And he has fulfilled the congregation's expectations of a dynamic and inspiring spiritual presence. I agree with that, Meredith. He holds a master's degrees in communication studies and philosophy and a PhD in government from the University of Virginia. He completed his theological studies at Meadville Lombard in 2003, and he was ordained in 2004. And from 2006 to 2016, he served as the minister at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship at Gainesville, Florida. And that's where I met you. How about that? So we want to welcome our 3 panelists, and we're eager to learn from you and to hear what you have to say about covenants this evening. So Rob, how about if you start us off?
Absolutely. So the first question we'd like you all to address is, from your position as ministers and leaders, what does it mean to lead people who have agreed to be in a covenantal community?
Yeah, I'm wondering, Marcus, can we spotlight the speakers and with me and Rob so that we can see each other and read our body language as best we can?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want us to jump in?
Jump in. Yes.
You know, the top of my mind, I think about the gift that it is to lead and be with people who are in covenant with each other. There's an intentionality that comes to that relationship. I mean, I'm so deeply honored to be a Unitarian Universalist minister and to have been called as a leader of a congregation, and certainly called to the presidency and elected to the presidency of the UUA. But there is an intentionality and depth to the relationships that can be built in covenant that is, I think, deepens our capacity for understanding and growth and sharing the journeys of our lives and the experiences of our lives. There is a lot of challenge in leading community, period. I think one of the gifts of covenant and a covenanted community is the intentionality of care and commitment to each other and to, you know, a shared mission or ministry. That kind of commitment isn't present in every relationship of neighbors or community. So that's one thing that comes top of mind.
I think covenant functions, I want to affirm the sense of privilege to be asked to be leader in a covenanted community. The covenant functions in at least a couple of different ways. Speech that Meg quoted from in her opening, the Rebecca Parker speech in 1998, is one that I refer to often. In that, Rebecca went back in the history of covenant and argued that the language of covenant is the icing on the cake. It is actually not the cake itself. That the covenant refers most importantly to how we live together, how we treat one another, how we stay in relationship with one another. And so to lead a community which is in covenant, we have the resource of the covenant to guide us, to refer to, and to shape the aspirations for how we will be together. The nature of covenant is that it's relational. And so to the extent that our current covenant, the association's current covenant, refers primarily to individuals rather than to the community or to the relationships, that would be a place that I would point to that I would hope the Article 2 Commission would be paying close attention.
Thank you.
I'm very appreciative of what Susan and Bill have said, and I would add a perspective that covenant's what holds us together. And let's notice that it's just about all that could hold us together as Unitarian Universalists. We are creedless. We don't have a creed to hold us together. And that's a really important part of what we're all about. We sometimes exaggerate how important that is. It is a crucial part of Unitarian Universalism that we don't have a creed, but we're not unique that way. It turns out that the Baptists don't have a creed either. The Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, they are officially creedless. That's not all that radical a thing to be. We are a bit more radical in being I would point our attention to canonless. We don't have the 5 books of the Torah, the 39 books of the Tanakh, the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, the 73 books of the Catholic Bible, or the 79 books of the Orthodox Bible, nor do we simply add all the Vedas and the Sutras and the Quran from other traditions. Ours is a boundless source. It's not a canon at all. We don't have a set of texts that are definitive for us. These are the ones we study. We are all the time discovering new texts, poems, books, essays that speak to our hearts and our soul. And that gives us an openness, but it also gives us something that needs to define us. And what it is that defines us then becomes what our covenant is. What is the agreement to walk together? And I appreciate particularly the icing on the cake, because the expression of the covenant is not the covenant itself. The way we express the covenant has to change with the times. My congregation is 112 years old. And until 2014, we had not ever formed a mission statement. 2014, we finally had a mission statement, and we have a covenantal commitment to be behind that mission. But we were a people of covenant from before we made that mission statement. Before we formed the words, we had that sense of walking together in love. We need to express it in words, but the words aren't the covenant. The covenant is eternal. The words change with the time, the society, the culture, as they need to.
Well, we want to thank you all for that, getting us off to a strong start. How did we arrive at agreement at what our covenant is?
I'll kick this one off. The question of covenant making is an interesting one. In history, going back to the formation of covenants originally religiously, it was between God and the people. It was a vertical relationship. And the covenant was simple. I will be your God if you will be my people, and vice versa. The covenants that we understand now are more horizontal, but I want to argue that they are grounded in a vertical dimension as well. Rebecca Parker in that speech talked about the covenant of grace, and that covenants being formed out of grace in gratitude for all that we have received. And I start there because covenant is a deeply embedded asset, resource for us that can tap into our deepest sense of what is holy and our deepest sense of what is important. It goes to the heart of the matter. So there's that, and the question of how our practice, what is our covenant around covenanting? It's my observation that covenants are formed and reshaped at the denominational level in response to groundswells of opinion. So the 1985 commission that was struck that created the purposes and the principles was actually responding to the women's movement in Unitarian Universalism, because the original language of the principles contained in the documents at merger was just rife with male domination language. And women said, no, this will not do. Similarly, the revision of the sources to include the earth-centered traditions was a result of a groundswell of opinion. Many Unitarian Universalists were finding their own spiritual path following earth-centered traditions. And they, in essence, said, the sources are incomplete if my source is not named therein. This, I think, argues for the expansion of the way we treat the sources that Alandria spoke to. But it's in response to a groundswell of opinion within our faith. It actually goes back to the point that the covenant is actually how we are together rather than how we talk about how we are together.
Yeah. Thank you. Others? Okay. Rob,
I was just going to say that was pretty complete, Bill.
That was good.
Yeah.
Well, I do have a sense that our movement has kind of had in the back of its mind that there's a generational rhythm to this. That yes, there was a specific need that emerged in 1985, but it also happened to be that that was a generation after 1961, and a generation had gone by, and it was time to review the principles again. And then another generation went by after the mid 80s, and in the aughts, we had an extensive process of review again. So every generation needs to consider again. Now, the process in the aughts ended up not producing any changes, but we had a deliberative and extensive process then to think about whether to have changes.
Okay, good.
You know, that lifts up just that we are a living tradition, and what you spoke about before, Meredith, about how you know, our covenants are imperfect articulations of what is universal, transcendent. It's our attempts to express that, and we learn and change. And that's, I mean, I love that about our faith, that we're not rooted in an unchanging past or unchanging definitions. We are a living tradition, that revelation is not sealed. And so I see that generational piece that you're describing, and also just acknowledging that that's also a core way that we articulate who we are as Unitarian Universalists.
Thank you. Rob?
So then thinking about that, right, and where our agreements come from, right, you know, and I'm reminded that Rebecca Parker has also said, and it's something that Paula mentioned to me, so I'm feeling your line, Paula, that you have to know what your covenant you're in now, right, before you make a new one, right? And one of the Rebecca Parker's points is that we've sort of inherited, you know, just relationships and traditions and previous covenants, and understanding, you know, and it seems to me that, you know, that the Commission on Institutional Change, in part, was one of the ways that we are understanding what our covenant actually is, right? How we actually relate, and how we are living or not living up to the promises we may make to each other, want to make to each other, you know, sort of want to be in. So with all that said, I want to turn the focus just a little bit to what impact does covenant have on our ministry to each other, right, and to the wider society. It's easy to say we have a covenant in our churches and among our churches, right? We know how hard it is to do, even though it's easy to say. But then what happens when we move beyond that, even to, you know, a wider covenant with the world? So I would like to get y'all's thoughts on what impact covenant has on those levels.
Darkness. This is we're getting into the more complicated parts of the way we use covenant, and I'll name one or maybe two of the complications. At my congregation, First Unitarian, and in most of the congregations that I visited as UUA president, when you ask people to define Unitarian Universalism, 99% of them will go to the principles, and they will start reciting with the first, and then they'll wonder about what the second one is, and then they'll recite the seventh, right? But they go to the principles as a definition of their faith. The principles are very important to most of our people. And I wonder how seriously we take them as a people. I have heard parts of the principles, part of our covenant, used as missiles in congregational conflict. Where one individual's inherent worth and dignity will be thrust at another's interdependent web of existence. These can be ill used in terms of our relationship. The other complexity here is, if covenant is actually how we are together, then there, I think, is a real question about whether covenantal language can be aspirational. In other words, can covenantal language support our hope to make this a liberating faith? Can it be motivating? Can it be equipping? Can it be supportive of the kind of transformation that we want to see? Or is it simply a description of how we are together today, which we know is deeply flawed? These are very complicated questions, I think, for us.
And I think, thank you for raising those, Bill. I think it absolutely has to be aspirational. We have to see ourselves as striving to live up to this, because if we thought that there was a definite thing that affirming and promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person was, and for the other seven, okay, sure, the other
You're right.
seven, making 8 in all. If we thought there was a definite way to do that, then it turns into the missile that Bill has talked about. We know exactly what it means to do that, and if you haven't done that, then you're out of covenant and can be called out or accused of that. Once we recognize that it's aspirational, we also recognize that we are all working on this together, and that distinguishes covenants from a contract. If you have a contract, you have one of the parties breaks the contract, and you can go to a court, and somebody will adjudicate who's violated the contract and what the remedies are. And we don't have any of that. We instead have a system of constantly needing to forgive ourselves and forgive each other and move together. It absolutely has to be aspirational if it's going to work in a way that isn't just a contract and isn't a missile that we use to throw at each other.
I wonder this. I agree that our covenants need to be aspirational. I wonder if, as they become ingrained, they're more likely to become missiles. I'm just curious. I haven't thought about that before, but as we come to just, memorize them, go to them a lot, understand deeply what we think each one means, if some of the aspiration actually disappears, not because the statements aren't aspirational, but because they're made so concrete in our own lives that we feel like we own them. And so, which is not what a covenant is about, isn't about owning the covenant. And to go back to the cake and frosting metaphor, this more than a year of pandemic has reminded us, without we as religious leaders needing to talk about the 7th principle, it has reminded us of our fundamental existential interdependence. Through my actions can help protect you or put you at risk. My breath can spread disease. The encroachment on our, in wild habitats allows more and more of these viruses to jump species. and more instances of pandemics, so that we have said, seventh principle, we are a part of an interdependent web. It is so obvious now. And I believe that covenant is our religious and theological response to that fundamental interdependence. That, you know, we think as UUs, we're not creedal. So the heart of the question for us is, how are we to live? And we do, out of universalism and Unitarianism, we have a vision of the, you know, what the Universalists called the kingdom of God, what we now so often call beloved community. We have that aspirational vision that we think is how we should live, given the fact that we are fundamentally connected and dependent to each other in life. And so it's that aspiration. If our principles aren't calling out that theological, religious aspiration from us, then they're not serving us. And I have heard so many people, including my own mom, talk about how come love is not in our principles, right? And Alandria Williams spoke to that, love in action. So there's also ways that covenant is changing, even if the principles haven't changed. The way those of us who grew up in this tradition with these principles articulate new ways of expressing that fundamental aspiration that grows out of our knowledge, our deep knowledge that we need each other and we belong to each other.
Yeah, thank you all. And so I want to take that maybe a little bit deeper. Why is it important for the covenant to be a living agreement that can be changed as we evolve? And we talked about the aspirational quality, the liberatory potential. I think Unitarian Universalism, especially as we're hearing it from you, has a tremendous potential that we are still learning how to tap into. But we are also in a society that has never really been just, right? And so as we talk about covenant and we talk about aspiration, we also have to deal with not just our evolution, but how do we create a future with a covenant that really means a lot to people who would use this faith as their spiritual home. And yet we're in a society that just as, I'm not even sure that we know how to define it yet. Don't all answer at once.
Well, it seems to be my role to get things kicked off in response to the question. There's a lot to say in response to your question, Paul. There's a lot to say. One of the things to say is that we have imagined a covenant and the principles which have been our expression of our covenant in ways which have been fundamentally individualistic rather than collective. And so if we have been way over on this side in terms of our valuing and protection of individual rights, at least most Unitarian Universalists, if we're able to rebalance, to recognize a greater importance for us collectively as congregations, for us collectively as a religious people, for us collectively as all religious peoples together, the body of the religious community, then you move into a conversation which is about accountability. It's about relationships within the congregation, yes, but also relationships between the congregation and other congregations, between individuals in the congregation and other justice-making partners. and you begin asking where those relationships need to be prioritized. Who needs to be listened to? Who do we need to make sure is at the table? Who do we choose? Because it's a choice. You can't be accountable to one. Who do we be accountable to? And we haven't really wrestled because accountability has not really much on our agenda until recently.
I agree with that, Bill, about the importance of accountability and what happens when you're not living into your aspirational covenants and you're breaking covenant. And another piece of it, it to me is around action, around what our responsibilities are, given we are a covenantal people drawn, committed to the beloved community, yet living in a system, living in a society where there is ongoing oppression, exploitation. Like what does that call us to do? So that's, another piece. And it's not about listing out actions, but just stating aspirational statements. And as you said, Bill, an individual commitment to those being true doesn't change fundamental structures. And so, looking at the ways that structures need to be systematically changed in order to create liberation, in order to create the beloved community. That is a critical part to me as well about what it means to covenant. And sometimes that may get in more to mission. What do we covenant to do? Here's what we value, what we commit to each other about how we will be together. What do we, in service of what? In service of what do we live in covenant? So maybe part of that action piece is part of the mission and purpose language, but it does seem that we covenant to do something together and to have the impact of that be beyond our own personal lives, because we know we're connected beyond our congregations, beyond our faith community as UUs. So I think that's important. And I think that, the change, the understanding that our language and the needs to express what we mean, and when we try to articulate the fundamental interdependence, the covenant at the heart, is going to change. And if it doesn't change, I think it can't call us into the future. We do realize the individualism, the ways that our covenant hasn't served us, hasn't transformed us, hasn't transformed our communities in the ways we hope for, nor our world. So, that is a time to reassess what covenants will help us live into the fullness of our values, the fullness of our theology.
It might be helpful to circle back to a distinction that Bill made a couple of questions ago between the vertical and the horizontal. Why do our covenants need to change? Well, at the horizontal level, it's a relationship between people. And when the people change, they need to make sure that they understand each other, that the language that they use to try to express the eternal covenant is language that is their language, that speaks to their issues and their needs. And when it comes to the vertical dimension, we are imperfectly trying to express, or perhaps it's not imperfect, but it is transient. It's the transient expression of an eternal relationship. And that has to change because we discover new truths through our relationship. We discover new ways of accessing the eternal. And so the way we express our covenant has to change according to our shifting understanding of the vertical relationship and our shifting reality of our horizontal relationship.
Good, thank you. I think this has been very insightful. Has it stimulated any last questions for you, Rob? I know you're thinking, I can hear it.
Yeah, well, thinking and articulating are entirely separate channels for me. So, but yes, I mean, yeah, it's been a great conversation. I'm curious if the panelists have any other kind of cross-pollinations that have happened as you kind of had this discussion, things you want to loop back to or say.
Yeah.
I have one thought here. You know, Alandria was quite clear that the work of anti-racism and anti-oppression needed to find an expression in our foundational language, and I certainly agree with that. I think there's also a need to at least hint at, and Susan, you were, I think, pointing in this direction, to hint at a sense of responsibility and a theory of change, and to say that that the agreement, at least within the Protestant mainline, through much of the 19th century, that religion was there to change the individual heart and convert it to, you know, to whatever, clearly was not able to deal with the kind of injustice in the world. I think we're in a similar situation now. The kind of expression of covenant that we have, that means so much to so many of the people that I serve, right, has not been able to engage us in the process of liberating either ourselves or changing the oppression in the world around us. So we need to have a kind of accountability, and I would understand it as a vertical accountability, Meredith, a kind of a vertical accountability to inspect the way our covenant has functioned and ask how we need it to function for us, if we're going to be the people, the religious people that we want to be, that we are called to be, that we promise ourselves that we will become.
Yeah, I appreciate that and how we understand how change happens. There has been a lot of focus on the individual and the individual's ability to change the world. You know, I mean, really not understanding the role of solidarity, the role of partnership, the role of long haul systemic work to change the system. And I think, I think there's ways in which, like in this present moment, not just the pandemic, but the last many years, I feel like I have experienced folks in our movement who thought that real change had happened. That, and it's not that, that change hadn't happened, but, who were part of the civil rights movement and, and made systemic change, right? And felt good about that. And now we see it is so undeniable the ways systemic supremacy, systemic white supremacy, exploitation, racism, that they moved, we have mass incarceration, all these systems are still there. And it took tremendous political will to push back against them. But that will has to be sustained, and it has to be deeply rooted in directly impacted communities who understand. I mean, one of the things I say is change doesn't come from the center. It never has. Change always comes from the margins, from the folks who experience the oppression directly and understand what needs to change in order for them to be free, for them to thrive, and that helps everyone thrive. So I think about the ways in which we recognize that our work has not gotten us where we want it to. And so what is the new, how do we understand change? And how can our covenant, our purpose, our the core of Article 2 call us to that commitment?
And I think that there is an eternal that calls us forward somehow. But if we're going to make that real, make that concrete, we're going to have to put it into our own words, however transient and fallible they may be. Whatever we are going to do to become a people of justice, a people that move ourselves and help move our society toward justice, is going to manifest in the way we express our commitments to each other. It's going to manifest through the work of hammering out what expression of covenant shall we do now. That's not the whole work, but that's going to inevitably be a part of the work, and a helpful part that tends to guide the rest of it.
We want to thank you for this part of our session. This has been educational, informative, in some ways pastoral, and challenging. All of that today, which is exactly where we need to be right now. And we do have a groundswell taking place. I won't speak specifically about it, but yeah, there's a lot of power behind this conversation right now. So thank you. Rob is going to now switch our focus so that everyone who's listening can participate in the reflection on covenant. And we are more than eager to get your information, so we hope that you stay with us and participate until the end. Rob?
Thanks, Paula. And let me stop sharing for just a moment and turn the chat back on. I'm dropping a link into the chat, which I will flash back up on the screen in just a moment. But what we would like to do now is to give you a chance to respond to what you've heard. When Reverend Sinkford, when Bill said, how do we need covenant to function for our growth in the future, is one of the things that the commission is very interested in. Right, and that's what we want to get your thoughts on. And so what you will see when you follow that link is a Google form that has some questions in it that we'd like you to answer. You can go back and edit your response later. It doesn't have to be perfect this time, but we would like you to do it now, right, while it's fresh. Strike while the iron is hot. And yeah, I apologize for my connection. I will type this into the chat momentarily.
While you do that, Rob, let me just kind of give us a challenge. Speaking of solidarity, let's see if we can get 100% participation in this questionnaire. Okay, Rob, back to you.
So yes, follow the link to the form, answer the questions, and then in 20 minutes, we will return back to this space for closing. But I will show on the screen again, it's just, it's a shortened URL that http://bit.ly/A2 covenant. If you go to that form or follow the link in the chat, it will take you there. I do encourage you to include your email at the bottom because that will let us put you on our mailing list so that you learn about future Article 2 events. and discussions. And we also encourage you to fill out the demographic information so that we can be sure that we are living up to our charge in terms of reaching out to as many kind of groups as possible. So, and if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A. Welcome back, everyone, to our space. Do feel free to keep the comments rolling in the chat. We have recorded the conversation part of this. We'll figure out the best way to kind of extract that and frame it up so that you can return to it or you can share it. I will say we will be having more of these kinds of gatherings in the future. This is the first of a series. We have a number of questions that the commission has that we want your all feedback. Several people in the chat have said how inspiring it is to hear a deep spiritual conversation and to hear how these leaders are sort of really walking their talk. We're all here because we love Unitarian Universalism. The panelists are for sure, the commissioners are, they said yes to this, but you all made time out of your evening. So I'd like to close and I'd like to give a chance to Greg Boyd, who has been a great benefit, as Cheryl mentioned earlier, and I think Paula agrees. You can't do our closing words and to close us out here. I'll turn it over to you, Greg.
I am delighted and thank you for that intro, Rob. This is one of my last duties as I finish my responsibilities as an elected trustee. No worries, you'll get to see a lot of me at General Assembly. So among the last is not definitely the last. And I offer you these words from Lifting Our Voices, one of our supplemental books of readings. And these are the words of David Blanchard. Do more than simply keep the promises made in your vow. Do something more. Keep promising. As time passes, keep promising new things, deeper things, vaster things, yet unimagined things. Promises that will be needed to fill the expanses of time and love. Keep promising.
That's great. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, panelists, for being here. Thanks to everyone who participated and to the Eighth Principle Learning community for giving us your space. And we hope we used it well for you.